The Singapore GP. You will learn why it is controversial and what it does to the racing drivers on it. We will be discussing if this sport has space for a race in Singapore in the future. Briefly explaining its history, the first Singapore GP wasn't really the Singapore GP. In fact, the first ever race was held in 1961. It was called the Malaysian GP since the state didn't have its independence yet, and it was held on a different street course than what we're used to today, the Thomson Road Grand Prix circuit. Then, in 1966, the race got the name we all know and love. It was still held yearly at that track until 1974 when F1 stopped going there for an extended period. It wasn't disputed again until 2008 when a new track called the Marina Bay Street Circuit was inaugurated, but we all know how the race that year ended. The race there was then held for 10 more years. The contract with F1 made us think that it would become a recurring appearance on the calendar, but due to Corona, the race had to be temporarily removed from the schedule for 2 years, which means that 2019 was the last year we saw a race unfold here and that Kevin Magnussen currently has the fastest lap of the race. But why then is this race regarded as controversial? Well, it should come as no surprise that Formula One cares about its drivers and their health, adopting standard procedures during the summer and winter break when temperatures are too extreme for a sporting event of this caliber. Even though you might say it's because of car performance, we all know that the F1 management is always concerned about drivers' health and safety, as seen with the new regulations against porpoising for 2023. The controversy stands within the fact that Singapore's ambient is not especially pleasant for drivers to race at. In fact, even though the race is held at night, the temperature of that tropical region is extreme for drivers not used to living in such conditions. In this case, air humidity plays a significant role in drivers requiring breaks while training or driving during practice. The humidity during the day usually goes over 95%. For reference, that is almost 30% more than New York's most humid month. This, paired with the extreme residual heat of the asphalt and prolonged exposure to the sun, makes it so that the perceived temperature from the drivers in the cockpit can reach 60 degrees Celsius. And that is with an open cockpit design. Just imagine how bad that would be inside of a GT car. Luckily, the track is pretty fast. With the 23 corners and the not-so-recent removal of the infamous Singapore sling, a left-right left turn now substituted by a narrow left-hander at turn 10, it will undoubtedly be a pleasure to see these new floor effect cars that can now follow each other more closely than ever race around the narrow streets of Marina Bay just like it was in Monaco earlier this year. But like in Monaco, the weather forecast isn't really on the driver's side. It is speculated that some rain could in fact fall onto the racetrack. First of all, making for the second ever rainy night race paired with 2017's edition of the race, and second, making for a more leveled playing field, making it hard for the Red Bulls, known to be fast thanks to their low drag cars and circuits where sudden acceleration is required, to take another victory trying to clinch Max Verstappen's championship with 5 races to go. As is common knowledge, F1 street circuits don't have any particular type of asphalt that guarantees higher grip, as the course is made to last as long as possible with as little money as possible since it is a public road, but this also implies that the drainage system of this kind of circuit is pretty much non-existent. In racetracks, asphalt is laid onto a series of finely machined stones, which together with the porous nature of the asphalt makes it so the water can just run through it and into the ground. This avoids making stagnant water on the surface, incredibly reducing the aquaplaning effect, which happens when a fine layer of water gets in between the rubber and the ground, significantly reducing grip and making the car slide. On the other end, everyday roads aren't made by a government that can afford to spend thousands of dollars for high-performance cars to race on. It can just assume that ordinary people driving around in wet conditions aren't exactly pushing the limit of the amount of grip that their standard tires have. So these roads aren't exactly made to drain quickly, often being laid on cement or other types of materials that don't let water through. You might guess that because this is a tropical region and in certain months rainstorms are frequent, the government would invest more in this type of infrastructure. Still, the reality is that there are much better ways to drain water from a road that can't be used on a racetrack, like metal drains, which do a much better job at draining water from the surface than what just asphalt would achieve. The question is now simple. Why don't circuits use this type of drainage system? Well, for one, they are not anchored to the ground, which is dangerous when a car passes over them at insanely high speeds. Even if they were, the sudden change in material and the patterns that these drains use to do their job would make them unsafe for a racetrack, which is simply not acceptable by any circuit standard. One time in Baku 2019, George Russell passed over a drain, lifting it up in the air and completely destroying Russell's floor, leading to the FP1 session being red flagged. As the car was being transported back to the pit lane, the truck transporting it hit a bridge with a crane, breaking it and spilling oil onto the track and making the session unable to restart. Well, you might say that it was the truck driver's fault in this case, but we can all agree it wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for the drain. So, we can say for sure that the track creates problems for the drivers, but since they need to race here too, how would they train for it? There are mixed answers to this question depending on who you ask, but one thing is a common theme between all 20 of the drivers: sweat. It is so hot in Singapore that drivers must get to the country as early as possible to make their lungs adapt to the different climate than what they are used to. Some, like Lando Norris, arrive about 1 week before the race, and others use another strategy, which is cardio in a humidity zone. I know this may sound like torture, but it is for their well-being during the race. They need to train this way if they want to be competitive. The most common way is to use the spin bike indoors, where they can control the temperature like Russell does. At the same time, the craziest drivers like Carlos Sainz and Sergio Perez willingly decide to train inside a working sauna with clothes on so they get used to the high humidity weeks before the race begins. During a recent interview, Kevin Magnussen stated, "There's no specific way to prepare, at least for me. I train as hard as I can, and as I said, Singapore is the race that I think of when I need some motivation to keep pushing in the gym." It will surely be interesting to see how drivers that have never raced here in their careers like Latifi, Tsunoda, Schumacher, and Cho will perform in conditions unlike anything on today's race calendar. At the end of the day, among all the street circuits that are on the Formula One calendar, Singapore, with its iconic landscape, attractive overtaking opportunities with the over-the-top maneuvers from the drivers, and the fact that the safety car hasn't yet missed a race since the reinstatement of the GP in 2008, it is certainly not one that needs to get out of the continuously expanding list of street tracks we see each year. Even though it isn't effortless for the drivers to adapt to the climate, it is not the first time F1 has raced under challenging conditions, and it certainly won't be the last. Whether you like it or not, F1 has recently signed a deal with the country to host the GP until 2028, so we won't get rid of it anytime soon. So, what do you think about the Singapore GP? Do you think it should stay on the calendar? Will Max get his second World Drivers' Championship in this race? And lastly, what is, in your opinion, the most demanding challenge F1 drivers need to overcome when moving from one circuit to another? Let us know with a comment below.